Let's imagine you wake up one day to find yourself accused of a crime. You demand information on exactly what it is that you've allegedly done, why you've been accused, and you insist on your innocence. You're told next to nothing about who has accused you and why, and the accusation is not substantiated. The more insistently you protest and defend yourself, the more suspicious your accusers seem to become. When finally brought before the court, your exasperation and indignation at the absurdity of your situation are interpreted by the judge and the jury as highly suspicious and as just more evidence of your guilt. The jury retires, deliberates, reaches its verdict, and finds you guilty as charged. The judge then sentences you, and you're promptly led away. This nightmarish scenario is loosely based on scenes from Franz Kafka's famous dystopian work, The Trial. And while you might think it unlikely that you would fall victim to such a grave injustice in your own life, you're probably already familiar with the fallacious pattern of reasoning that is acted out in this dystopian scenario. This fallacy has come to be known as the Kafka trap in honor of the great Czech author. In essence, a Kafka trap occurs whenever a person's strong denial of guilt or defense over an alleged offense, or even their silence, is interpreted as further evidence of their guilt. A common example of this dynamic occurs in the context of the alcoholic or the drug addict. It's often said that when you confront an addict and suggest that they might have a problem, one of the first things that they're likely to do is strongly and repeatedly deny that they have a problem. Of course, sometimes that's true. Sometimes strenuous rejection of an accusation is indeed a sign that the person is simply in denial about their addiction. Where this slips into a Kafkatrap fallacy is if strong denial on its own is taken as sufficient evidence that the person is indeed guilty of the charge in question. Where Kafka traps become particularly effective and insidious is in the context of accusations about people's characters or their motives. As these can be entirely internal aspects of people's lives, concrete proof might be considered an impossible standard to have to meet. What's more, when a person accuses another person of having certain motives or character flaws, it's hard to concretely disprove such accusations. It becomes essentially your word against mine. Let's make this clearer with another example. Suppose you accuse me of hating red-haired people, of being fundamentally anti-red-haired people. You may even suggest that I'm not even aware of my own prejudice and hate, that this hatred is so deep-seated and fundamental to my existence that I cannot even see it. Here's where the Kafka trap move becomes especially powerful. Seeing as this is an accusation about some internal attitude or disposition of mine, any outward action or past statements that I've made, for example, are not necessarily proof or disproof. I could, for example, secretly be anti-red-haired, even if I've always been perfectly polite to red-haired people. Objective proof or disproof becomes of secondary importance. If you can introduce the Kafka trap here, then it's going to be much more effective and much more difficult for me to demonstrate my innocence. My accuser might say, for example, anti-reds are nearly always strongly in denial that they're actually anti-red-haired people. Of course they would be. They know that other people would avoid them if it were revealed that they were prejudiced against red-haired people. They want to believe that they're good people, so they rationalize or strongly deny it. The more strongly they defend themselves and deny the accusation, the more obvious it is that they're just fragile about their prejudice or are afraid of being exposed. Now it goes from being your word against mine to being your words and my words against me. The more strenuously I deny my guilt or defend myself, the more I reinforce this idea that I am engaging in typical anti-red-haired behavior. In this case, I would have been Kafka trapped. If a large enough number of people become convinced that strong denial equals evidence of guilt, then the Kafka trap can work very effectively on a social scale. And the more people that become convinced, the more tempting it is to use it against people whose compliance or persecution you seek. Another sinister element of the Kafka trap is that it appears to leave only two options open: admission of guilt or silence. The problem with silence, of course, is that it's not a very powerful defense or counter-argument. It simply allows people, and especially, of course, your accusers, to project their own judgments and accusations onto you. It should be obvious where the fallacy is here. Just because some people who are in fact guilty of a certain transgression or crime do indeed sometimes strongly and insistently deny it, it doesn't mean that all those who strongly and insistently deny or defend themselves against an accusation are guilty of the crime or transgression in question. In isolation, the Kafkatrap fallacy is obvious and quite a weak argumentative move. Under normal circumstances, most people would see right through it. However, in the right social, cultural, or political context, it can become a powerful and dangerous engine of moral panic. We don't need the nightmare of Kafka's dystopia to imagine how this might play out in the real world. We already have historical examples. The Salem witch trials was an early manifestation of a similar dynamic. None of those accused of being witches who confessed were convicted or executed, but all 19 people who refused to confess and maintained their innocence were found guilty and executed. The accused quickly figured out by watching these early trials that a confession of guilt could spare you from the gallows. Strong denial of guilt was assumed to be deception and thus further evidence of an impure character. The case of Salem may seem a kind of bizarre one-off hysteria with the benefit of hindsight, but so great was the fear of witches at the time and so powerful were religious authorities and religious belief that Kafka traps were highly incentivized. Confess or accuse others before you are accused to make sure that you're in the in-group and not in the out-group. A similar dynamic re-emerged in the United States in the late 1940s with the so-called Red Scare and accusations of communism under McCarthyism. Fear of the supernatural and Cold War paranoia, these no longer grip the modern imagination in the same way, but that doesn't mean that we don't have our own cultural and ethical taboos and bogeymen. There are still accusations in our societies that are powerful enough to ruin people's reputations and even their lives. When the accusation is purely about alleged psychological attitudes or emotional dispositions or moral character flaws that most of society deems unacceptable, the temptation to use the Kafka trap increases, as does its power to silence, blackmail, and even destroy people.